Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining the Hudson Library tonight for our author program with Professor Natalie Dykstra. She's joining us tonight for a conversation about her recently published book, Chasing Beauty, The Life of Isabella Stewart Gardner. Before I introduce our author this evening, I want to just take a moment and mention some of our upcoming programs we have going on here at the Hudson Library. During the month of April, our Adult Services Department is doing a tour of Peru. So many of the programs that we have during the month, even though we're halfway through April, we still have some coming up. They highlight art and culture of Peru, and we have a couple art history programs on Peruvian art, and we also have a tour coming up, a virtual tour coming up in Peru at the end of the month. So take a look at the library's website for all of our upcoming programs. We also have a lot of exciting authors coming up in the next couple weeks, including biomedical engineer Dr. Rachel Lance, author of Chamber Divers, journalist McKay Coppins, author of Romney, A Reckoning, law professor Barbara McQuaid, author of Attack from Within, and best-selling authors Eric Larson will be here in person, and Jennifer Shiverini. So we have April brochures on the back table you can grab on your way out that have all of our April programs, or you can see all of our upcoming programs on the library's website. We also have with us tonight, the Learned Owl is selling copies of Chasing Beauty, and we also have refreshments in the back if you'd like to help yourself. Allow me to please introduce our author this evening. Joining us is Professor Natalie Dykstra, and she's the author of Clover Adams, A Gilded and Heartbreaking Life. Her work on Isabella Stewart Gardner has won a Public Scholars Award from the National Endowment for the Humanities and an inaugural Robert and Ina Caro Research Travel Fellowship sponsored by the Biographers International Organization. She is Emerita Professor of English and Senior Research Professor at Hope College and lives just outside of Boston. So please join me in welcoming Natalie Dykstra.
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming out on this beautiful evening. Ohio has these beautiful rolling hills. It's wonderful to be back in the Midwest. I was 20 years a faculty member at Hope College and retired in order to finish this book during the pandemic, so it's lovely to be here. And thank you, Allison, Gwen, and Lisa for making all the arrangements and making it so easy to be here in this distinguished author series that you have here. Can everyone hear me okay with the microphone? Oh, no, can't? Okay, so should I be more like this? Okay, I'll try to be more like this as much as I can. Okay. So I always start with a question asked in Isabella's own time. Who was this remarkable woman? Someone who seemed to shimmer with an unknowable light. My favorite letter by Henry James to Isabella was his last one to her, dated April 20, 1914. You shine out to me with undiminished interest, and in your splendid setting, he wrote, of so much art and so much honor. I am your faithfulest, and further back now, surely than anyone, old Henry James. I love how her friend compared her to a jewel in a setting. Early in my research, someone asked me, what's your argument about Gardner? I don't know, I said. I'm not entirely sure how her story ends. People are never the sum of our theories about them. Virginia Woolf has a memorable phrase for the genre, this interweaving of an intimate story with larger historical forces. She called it a fish in the stream. I love that. There are always surprises or eddies in how a story moves that cannot be anticipated ahead of time. I like the constraint of fact and evidence that biography imposes. Yet within that demanding limit, one draws on the tools of fiction to bring the subject alive for the reader. Elements of fiction such as scene and detail, metaphor, pace, tension, voice, place, all with the aim of elucidating character. For the last decade, I've had the great fortune of reading and thinking and writing about Isabella, how much I've learned and how much she has taught me. There is a lot to tell, but what I'd like to do tonight is do a brief overview of her life, then read 2 excerpts, very short, from chapters, leaving plenty of time for your questions. She was born in 1840 in Manhattan, the oldest daughter of David and Adelia Stewart. Her father was a merchant who traded in Irish and Scottish linen. The family attended fashionable Grace Church at the bend of Broadway and 10th Street, a 10-minute walk from her nearby girls' school. The sketch to the right by another student is of a high-ceilinged room where she studied, and I simply love that chandelier. In her 16th year, her parents took her to Paris, where she enrolled in a Protestant convent school. Her classmates were from around the world, but her closest friends were 2 girls from Boston, Helen Waterston on the left, and Julia Gardner, whose older brother, Jack Gardner, would later come to Paris to stay with his family. A word about Helen. In Isabella's friendship album, you'll notice at the bottom left of the screen, their signatures. You'll see Julia Gardner, Boston, Helen Waterston, Boston. We know who Julia was, but who's Helen? A brief search brought me to the Massachusetts Historical Society, where I first read through Helen's vivid diaries, which she kept almost daily from 1855 to 1858, and I will never forget the moment I turned the page, dated December 8, 1856. Here Helen describes her first meeting with Isabella Stewart, a New York girl. There she is, I thought, a teenager. Helen's pages comprise a witness of Belle that rhymes with the woman she would become. By the time Isabella returned to New York, she was already sophisticated, having seen much of the art of Paris, Florence, and Rome, and able to speak and read its languages. In Milan, after seeing the private collection of Count Pezzoli, a home later transformed into a museum, she turned to a friend and said, "If I ever have any money of my own, I'm going to build a palace and fill it with beautiful things." At 20, she married Jack Gardner, a son of wealthy Boston Brahmin families. His older brother, George, described him as handsome, quiet, sufficiently at ease with the ladies, someone who danced beautifully. Where Belle was fiery, Jack was calm, and he thought Belle was the most interesting woman he had ever met. Early on, the young couple suffered terrible tragedies. After her first pregnancy ended in a stillbirth, they welcomed a blue-eyed boy who was given his father's nickname, Jackie. In the waning weeks of the Civil War, Jackie died before his 2nd birthday. It was a derailing grief, as if she'd been exiled from womanhood, when so much of being a woman at that time was being a mother. She almost didn't make it. What saved her was overseas travels to Europe first, but then to Egypt, India, the Holy Lands, and later an extended tour of Asia, including Japan, China, and Cambodia. And these are 2 examples, 2 pages from 2 different travel albums. One from Japan, and she loved to press flora and fauna in her travel albums, as other women did. And the other is she loved to collect these photographs of paintings she had seen in various museums around the world. And this is an example from Florence. She meticulously documented her travels in these large covered travel albums, 28 in all, and in an early album, during her 1874 trip down the Nile, she wrote diary entries in the album. And on the right-hand side, I'm going to read to you a transcription of what she writes at the bottom of the page. And I want you to listen to the sound of her voice. After seeing by moonlight the Luxor complex at Karnak, with its hundreds of columns inscribed by hieroglyphics reaching to the sky, quote, I never had such an experience, and I felt as if I never wanted to see anything again in this world, that I might shut my eyes to keep that vision clear. It was not beautiful, but grand, mysterious, solemn. I felt it, even more than saw it. By the 1880s, she and Jack had established a regular routine of travel in Europe every 2 years, tours which ended with a long stay in Venice, often at the Palazzo Barbaro and on the Grand Canal. She would be inspired by the Barbaro's, quote, whirlwind of suggestion, to borrow Henry James's evocative phrase. Most of her letters she later consigned to bonfires, asking others to do likewise, though once she became the famous Mrs. Jack. Some people thankfully defied her wishes. And the letters that survive are full of speedy sentences, wit, and warmth. She's particularly adept at setting the scene, as in this description of Hong Kong. This is the opening slide of the China album. At sunset in 1883, listen to this, you can just see this. The clear-cut hills were every color, from bright red, pink, orange to pale blue, all reflected in the water. Then the light faded. Night came so slowly, and one by one the stars in the heavens, in the still water, and in the city came out, and it was all a twinkle. And I love the pace of a 1906 letter written when she was in Paris. I'm sitting by my high-up window overlooking the Tuileries Gardens, where a band is playing. Weather still cool and fresh. I saw Henry Adams yesterday and was with him in his auto all afternoon, seeing old cathedral glass and motoring through Versailles. These motor cars do cover the ground. Isabella loved to move fast. She was athletic, a fast runner, and spun across the dance floor. She loved speedy horses and buggy rides. She was not very tall, but she filled a room. She listened with great intensity, and people commented on her low, melodic voice. She had a remarkable memory for what she heard and saw, and had an equally terrible temper. But her capacity to enjoy was life-giving, whether it was travel or, as she said, grubbing in the earth in her beautiful gardens at their country estate outside of Boston and Brookline, and this is her Italian garden and also her Japanese garden, or raising puppies. Also saving was her curiosity. She spent her 30s and 40s getting educated. She studied Italian to read Dante. She attended lectures given by Charles Eliot Norton at Harvard. She invited scholars and writers and musicians for dinner. She first collected clothing and jewelry, what was near at hand for a woman of her social class. She understood how fabric could catch the candlelight and which shapes and cuts flattered her. She was said to glide across a room like a boat on calm seas, and the cut of her dress only amplified this graceful effect. Henry James teased her not to spend all her money on clothes, and soon enough, on the advice of Norton, she turned to collecting rare books. She was gathering her forces, preparing and expanding and learning all the time. She and Jack began buying artwork in the 1870s, mostly by the French Barbizon painters, and their homes were full of treasures. These images by the architectural photographer Thomas Marr depict the Gardner home at 152 Beacon Street, and you can see a through line from these rooms to her museum galleries many years later. By the time she bought Vermeer's The Concert in Paris in 1892, she had trained her eye. And there's more about this purchase later when I read from a clip from the book. That year, she had inherited money from her father's estate, and a rush of collecting followed. She surely had help from the art dealer Bernard Berenson and others when buying this wondrous Rembrandt self-portrait. On the arrival of her Velázquez portrait of King Philip IV in Boston, she wrote giddily to Bernard Berenson, "His Majesty has arrived." She put arguably the greatest masterpiece of her collection, Titian's The Rape of Europa, in her red drawing room near the fireplace. It was becoming increasingly clear to both Isabella and Jack that something had to be done to keep the collection secure. On a snowy night in late 1898, Jack Gardner collapsed from a stroke and died at the age of 61. Now Isabella's path to realizing her vision, a house with beautiful things, was again marked by grief. But she persisted, securing a large parcel of land not a month later. Plans were soon drawn up by her architect, Willard T. Sears, and that's the gorgeous courtyard. It doesn't yet have a roof in his design, but it will, a glass roof. She knew she was taking a terrible risk. What she was attempting to do was sui generis. She fought with the city about its regulations. She had trouble keeping a skilled work crew. She had sleepless nights about money. And yet, there's delight in her missives to Berenson describing how she frequently went to the work site to oversee its innumerable crises and details, always bringing along her lunch pail. And here she is you can just see her silhouette on the ladder inspecting the work. Unafraid. She was unafraid. As the century turned, the large palace with its plain exterior rose up on the marshland of the Fenway. Inside its 4 stories was a lush interior courtyard ringed by 3 stories of galleries and topped by a glass roof. Her singular accomplishment, a Venetian-style palazzo turned inside out, was filled room after room, not only with paintings, but tapestries, prints, porcelain, statues, manuscripts, stained glass, and fine furniture. She secured her vision by stipulating in her will that her installation of the galleries never be changed. Fenway Court, as the museum was known in its day, was open to the public in the winter of 1903, almost 40 years after the birth of her son, Jackie. The responses of her first visitors were many and rapturous. I particularly liked the letter of the philosopher William James, who wrote to her enthusing how deeply moved he was by, quote, the aesthetic perfection of all things, unquote. I remember the wow the first time I went to the Gardner Museum more than 20 years ago. I was deep in my research for my first book on Clover Adams. I'd been dreading writing about her death by suicide, and I needed some cheering up. Sitting on a bench looking into the soaring space of the museum's central courtyard, abloom with flowers, I mused, oh, to write about Isabella, someone so embracing of life, fierce and fearless. Isabella's story has been told, of course, but earlier biographies and depictions of her somehow never quite matched the soulfulness of the museum itself, of the intimate feeling in the galleries, or of its astonishing sweep and the largeness of its spiritual claim. I'd long been interested in photograph albums and other memory keeping by women in the 19th century. The subject of my first book, Clover, the wife of Henry Adams and a gifted photographer, kept her photographs in 3 red-letter albums, and that's probably her most well-known photograph. She had 113 in all. I started to wonder if the galleries in Fenway Court could be understood, even in part, as a kind of 3-dimensional album. So instead of paging through an album, one walks through the rooms of a palace. She intended a visitor to move through the rooms in sequence, from the early Italian room to the high Renaissance of the Raphael room on the left, then to the intimacy of the 18th century French salon on the right, and so on to the chapel at the end of the third floor gallery and its large stained glass window. When the sun shines, jewel-like reds and blues pool on the stone floor. In a notebook I filled to keep my bearings, I early on wrote this about being in the Gardner Museum. The way one moves from space to space, this happens, then this, which suggests a sequence, a narrative, like a poem or a story. Can objects, in other words, be eloquent like words? Can or do they testify? Henry Adams once said, a biographer faces two kinds of challenges: too few sources about a subject or too many. And Isabella's archive has both challenges at once. There's far less documentation of her early years. We've seen her friendship album, her drawing book, and you can't quite see it, but she says, this is done very badly. She had opinions at 14. There's an extraordinary family window called the Stewart family window at Grace Church in New York that I found and is part of the story. It was put up by her parents in 1883 in memory of her three younger siblings, all of whom died before she did, before her. And this is a wonderful sketch by Jack while they were courting. Notice the arrow through the heart. I had a feeling sometimes I was weaving her story from gossamer threads. A detail here, a mention in a diary there, but all of it mattered. I laughed out loud when I first saw this envelope that reads, Mrs. Gardner, Esquire, well-known lady in high life. The postmaster wrote, try Mrs. Jack. And of course, the envelope arrived because we have it in the archive. Then, by the time she was collecting her masterpieces in the 1890s, I had the opposite challenge, a deluge of material, reams of dealer files, and these are the lists of everything that they bought that Jack would meticulously keep, and there's just pages and pages of this. Her 28 travel albums, her 17 guest books, large gallery cases filled with letters and other memorabilia, Jack's diaries, and Isabella's innumerable lists. She even titled a large leather-bound notebook, List of Things for the Museum. Notice at the top, Europa by Titian. The musicians, that's the Vermeer. And I always love the one Delacroix at the end. In another journal entry, this one dated May 17, 2022, I wrote, what is my task? To tell the truest story I can. Be meticulous, stay grounded. Then I added like a warning, don't get lost. Okay, I'm going to conclude with brief excerpts from two chapters. The first is from a chapter called The Concert, 1892. It's about the purchase of the Vermeer. And then from the end of the prologue, when John Singer Sargent comes to Fenway Court to paint her last portrait. I'm going to do it this way so I can see it. On Monday, December 5, 1892, Belle and Jack left their rooms at the Hotel Westminster for a leisurely lunch at the nearby Café de Paris. From there, they traveled by carriage to the premier auction house in all of France, the Hôtel de Roux, a crowded neighborhood of busy shops. Up for sale that day was an important, well-known collection of Dutch art. The de Roux had been established in 1852 and was housed in a broken-down building of cream-colored stone, which had been sullied and defaced by the smoke and storms of urban life. There, anything that could be sold was sold: wines, pictures, old clothes, furniture, machinery. Even stage scenery from local theaters was broken up and offered at auction. The rooms were bustling, crowded with people from every social rank. Sales of finer items occurred on the upper floors. Here, Belle had bought a pair of elegant 18th century silver goblets the previous May, but the December auction would be on a wholly different scale. The collector and French critic, Tor Berger, had done more than anyone to revive the reputation of the 17th century Delft painter, Johannes Vermeer, who had fallen out of favor earlier in the century. 59 paintings, the core of the collection, were now on view in the large sales room. Isabella would have seen Rembrandt's, Steen's, and the exquisite Goldfinch by Rembrandt's student Karel Fabritas, the painting Tor Berger most liked to gaze upon at the end of his day. The auction catalog listed 5 works by Vermeer. Belle chose a luminescent painting measuring just 25 by 28 inches, aptly titled The Concert. It depicted a scene both familiar and dear to her heart, a musical performance in a private home. Isabella arranged with her regular Paris agent a scheme whereby she, a woman, could participate in the Drouot auction discreetly. That day, she sat directly outside the sales room in a spot where he could see her. To signal interest in an object, she was to hold her white handkerchief over her mouth, but pull it away when she wanted out of the bid. The bidding was brisk. There was a lot to sell that day. Did her heart race a little as the price went up and up? Did she have a limit in mind, one she didn't want to exceed? She got her painting for 29,000 francs, or $6,000, outmaneuvering far more experienced bidders. Agents from London's National Gallery took home a pair of Vermeers, and the small Goldfinch sold for 5,500 francs. By this point in her life, Isabella had amassed a sizable collection of many kinds of beautiful objects, placing them with care in her homes. Thomas Russell Sullivan, playwright of Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, and Mr. Hyde, remembered in a journal entry dated February 6, 1891, and here he's describing exactly that room, her boudoir, in the picture, in the photograph. Lunch today with Mrs. J.L. Gardner in her boudoir. It is filled with rare and beautiful things from every clime. Above the wainscot is a frieze of portrait heads, early Italian, 30 in all. A Dutch landscape, all gold and red and brown, is let into the wall over the fireplace. The hangings are priceless, Chinese and Indian from imperial looms. She was already skilled at casting a spell with her surroundings, creating moods and feelings and experiences. During her visit, Isabella gestured to Sullivan, saying, "Everything here is a remembrance." The scene, purchasing, having, arranging, admiring, all of it was filled with memories of chasing beauty. But with the Vermeer purchase, Isabella stepped through a kind of portal. She became a collector. Hers was the first Vermeer brought to Boston and the second to America. Its acquisition confirmed, most of all to her, that she now had formidable expertise in choosing art. Her many discussions with John Singer Sargent and James Whistler over dinner and in the painter's Paris and London studios, her tutorials with Charles Eliot Norton, her book collecting and travels, her long hours at the Louvre and at the Prado and London's National Gallery, and her conversations with Henry James, all these had prepared her for this moment, to trust her eye, to be confident in her taste, to buy the object or painting she wanted. Object after object arranged in a room, like word after word on a page, would speak what she could not or did not choose to say aloud. This is just 3 paragraphs, so we're almost done. On September 14, 1922, an especially warm day, the painter John Singer Sargent paid a visit to Fenway Court, where Isabella Stewart Gardner, now 82 years old, lived on the 4th floor, as she had since her museum's opening almost 20 years earlier. He knew the palace well. The two had been friends since Henry James introduced them in 1886. 2 years after that, Sargent's large oil portrait of her, with its ropes of pearls and show of milky arms, scandalized Boston's elite Brahmin society, much to her delight. She invited the painter to live and work for a month at her museum after its opening, which he did, using the 3rd floor Gothic room. She collected a number of his works, including the theatrical El Jaleo with its life-size dancer in mid-step, seemingly ready to sweep across the entire south wall of the 1st floor Spanish cloister. Now Sargent asked to paint his friend's portrait again. He did so quickly in the span of a morning's visit. A debilitating stroke in 1919 had paralyzed Isabella's right side, so this photograph was also taken in 1919. It's probably the last of her standing, and that's her with John Singer Sargent. Though she managed to dress every day and was able to sit upright, her life had been much changed. She used the hydraulic elevator that she had installed decades before to travel from her 4th floor apartment to spend time with her magnificent art collection on the lower floors of the palace. And she liked to sit in her office, the McKnight Room on the 1st floor, surrounded by artwork made by her contemporaries, men and women both, with her books and travel mementos near at hand. Here she received visitors and welcomed Sargent, who brought along his paints. Sargent's composition, entitled Mrs. Gardner in White, is a harmony of color and pattern, suggested with light washes of watercolor. Isabella is seated on a sofa against red-striped pillows, swathed head to foot in a shroud-like fabric that frames her face and hides her crippled hand and right side. The painter's genius for depicting draped fabric is on full display. The painting has both clarity and mystery, to borrow Colm Toibin's precise phrase for what characterizes Sargent's best portraits. He also catches a quality of Isabella's observable since childhood, a powerful force of feeling. If her body and limbs are still, her eyes hum and buzz with life. She had seen much, searing loss, but also accomplishment and great beauty. Margaret Chandler, a friend, thought it was a wonderful sketch of her in this last stage, quote, pale and frail and dominating to the end, noting how, quote, her green eyes had lost none of their bright malice. Seeing, appreciating, appraising. Sargent pictures Isabella in the here and now, even as her garment references what is to come. But he also renders something of a surprise. In his masterpiece of old age and impending death, he does not forget youth, her youth. A woman's bright lip and cascade of dark curly hair is just visible in the shadow on the pillow behind the sitter's left shoulder. The image in the shadow is as unmistakable as it is provocative. It is as if Sargent is saying that even the ravages of age cannot dim the vitality of who Isabella once was, who she still is. This, then, is her story. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. What a great audience. Isn't that amazing? That an amazing watercolor? And he did it just in like 3 or 4 hours. He was a genius. He was just a genius.
Do we have any questions for the author tonight?
Yes. Hello.
This is a little bit beyond the scope of your book, but I'm curious if anything further has been found about the things that were stolen from you.
I've been practicing for this question. I've been practicing for this question.
The owner and the mob are responsible, and they're using the paintings as underworld currency. That's the last thing I've heard. Is anything further than discovered?
No, I mean, it's an ongoing investigation. And I've been asked, why didn't you start your book with the theft? Because it's what the museum is so known for around the world. But it's really not my story to tell, it's the museum's story to tell. And because it's an ongoing investigation, I guess I felt very careful about that. At the end of the book, you'll read a little bit more about the theft, but you know what I know. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because in some ways, the theft for that time, it happened in March of 1990, it ended up overshadowing somewhat the museum, right? And yeah, and that's a shame. And yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Has anybody ever figured out where all the money came to invest from to invest all this?
Yes, there is. It's a mix of. So she inherited from her father, who traded in Irish and Scottish linen. He was a second-generation Scottish immigrant, and in Lower New York. And then he, early on, like many East Coast merchants, he invested in stock and in Calumet mines in Michigan and for in the railroads. And so that's where her inheritance from him is where she used that to purchase her art. She and Jack had a very interesting financial life because they kept very careful track of where his money was going and where her money was going. And that was just interesting to see that in a 19th century family. And then the Gardner family was, Jack's mother was a Peabody, from Peabody, Essex. So that trade was mostly with Sumatra and in the pepper trade, but also other goods. There was a very good book published by the museum recently that really carefully tracks sort of the sources of their wealth. So I highly recommend that. Does that answer your question?
I think so. I mean, looking at the art as a whole in the museum, I think she was kind of
Yeah, right. She just chose incredibly well. And she was earlier in the art market just by several years than J.P. Morgan and Frick and all the other great sort of robber baron art collectors that built the Met and the Frick Museum, obviously. And so there's a letter where she says, "Oh, why can't I be as rich as Frick and Morgan?" Right? Because as soon as they enter into the market, there's a great line about J.P. Morgan that he hoovered up palazzos. He would just buy the whole palazzo, and then he would decide what art to keep. So, I mean, they were rich on a far greater scale than she was. She was wealthy, but she was wealthy with older American money. Yes, you're welcome. Good question. Hello.
Do you feel after all your research that she ever was accepted into this snobby Boston?
It was a struggle. I mean, it was definitely a struggle. I think there was one moment where her early biographer, in his notes, not in the biography itself, but in his notes, remarked that she was, when she would send out invitations for dinners or dances or that people started to accept because they didn't want to miss out. They didn't want to miss out. That there had been a long time where she felt set apart. You know, Boston Brahmin families were it's all those intermarriages, right? The Cabots and Lowells and Putnams and Perkins and, right? And they're all intermarried and they're all having those sons and Lowells and, yeah. It's astonishing how intermarried those families are. And that made for a very secure social world in the 1830s and 40s, right? It's from there that we get the Boston Public Library and the Boston Athenaeum, and of course they built up Harvard, and I mean these extraordinary Mass General, all these extraordinary institutions that still are thriving, but it made it very hard to break in because even if you married into the family, into a Brahmin family, you were still considered an outsider in a way that was different than in New York, because New York was just so much bigger. It was just, people could break in and rise fairly quickly, and Boston, not as much. So after the Civil War, what ends up happening is a lot of Bostonians, young men who are ambitious and really want to make their name, they go to Chicago. They move west, or Cleveland, right? They come here because you just couldn't quite break in. So, I mean, she has the last laugh, right? So, but yeah, her relationship to Boston is complicated. That's a good question. Yes?
When did her house become public?
So she opens it in 1903, right? So she, yes, she lived part-time there for quite a few years, and then she had an estate outside of in Brookline, where she had those beautiful gardens. So she would kind of live there in the summer and then live in Fenway Court in the winter months. And it became a public institution, or identified as, in 1903. But there were few open days, right? She had to have enough open days for tax reasons. Right, and there's a long, complicated story about how she gets in trouble with taxes and tariffs, and yeah. So,
Is her home in Brookline and the garden still preserved?
oh, that's a very nice story. The home is, and luckily the young couple who bought it about 6 or 7 years ago, it had been in the Gardner family all these years, inherited from one generation to the next. But that land there was so much of it, and it's right near the city, and it was split apart. And so one property owns what's left of the Italian garden, and another property owns the vestiges of the Japanese garden. But the house itself, which is beautiful, is recognizable, it's recognizable. So it's wonderful to see. It was thrilling I had a chance to be on those grounds and see it. And it's very high. There's a high hill in Brookline. And so she loved to look out her window over into the city. She could see the city at a distance. So, yes.
By any chance, do you know if she loved nasturtiums?
Yes, she did love nasturtiums. Yes, that's her. Yes, that's her. She grew nasturtiums. Yes, that's in honor of, yes, absolutely. So it's the last, they're just taking them down today because it's Patriots Day and the Boston Marathon, and they always take them down on Patriots Day. So, but that's always the glory of April in Boston, is to see the nasturtiums that hang from the balconies. So the court, as you could see from that black and white photograph, is almost an inside-out palazzo. And they hang these nasturtiums down the walls. It is really extraordinary. Yes.
Do they still have an indigo blue hydrangeas in the spring?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not entirely sure of, my story, she dies in 1924, and then after that, like the theft, I sort of step off the stage, so that's a good question. But, for anyone interested in seeing the current museum as it is now, they have a really beautiful website. And there's lots to explore, and you can take an audio tour here. You can sort of see the rooms, you can visualize the rooms. It's really wonderful how much they've done. So it's not to be missed. Yes.
Did she have a particular favorite in her collection?
Oh, that is a very good question. Yes, I think the Botticelli that's in the Long Gallery, it's a Madonna and Child. It's just this extraordinary kind of jewel-like colors. I mean, Botticelli's Madonnas are just, they're so, I mean, you could just stand there and stand there and stand there. I do know that's one of her favorite paintings. I think she knew the Titian, Rape of Europa. was probably her most important painting, and the fact that that didn't get stolen is just like, every time I would look at it, I think, oh, thank goodness, thank goodness. So she wasn't terribly fond of Rembrandt. She knew it was important to collect him. A lot of Americans were collecting him, but she wasn't in love with Rembrandt like a lot of collectors were. So the Vermeer, I think, was particularly important to her. You know, music was as important as art, and I tried to fill the book with as much about her knowledge and passion for music as I possibly could. She was so good at being a patron of young musicians and giving them an opportunity to play their new compositions. So there's a wonderful composer named Charles Loeffler, who she was very important to him. So, yes.
In this time period, was it unusual, or were there other women collecting, or was it unusual for her to be a woman collector?
It was unusual, I mean, just by the numbers, but there were important women collectors. So Louise Havemeyer was an important collector in New York. Mrs. Potter Palmer in Chicago. She was very involved in the 1893 World's Fair, and she had collected a lot of French Impressionist art. And it was shown there, and that's an extraordinarily important collection. Yes, there were absolutely other women collectors, but what they tended to do, I think Potter Palmer's, I'm saying that name reversed, I can't, does anybody know that name? The Chicago collector. I think that's all at the Chicago Art Institute. So what happened was women would have large collections, but they would donate it to the existing museum. What's new is that she creates from foundation to roof a building and designs it, helps design it to house her collection. That's new. And that's new, male or woman or man, right? Frick doesn't even do that. He has an existing mansion that he converts, but it's not, he doesn't design it from the ground up like she does. So that's a very good question. And there's a lot of good scholarship on sort of women collectors and how it was a way to enter into the public sphere. Because I think it was in part related to beauty and feeling, and you know, there was an idea that looking at art would improve you, right? Would educate you. It's the idea behind Central Park, right? That's important to have public spaces because in a city, because it encourages health and growth and all these things. And so they talked about the importance of art, but there was also a feeling in the United States that we were behind. We were endlessly behind. We were this incredibly new country, right? So we were extraordinarily wealthy in that Gilded Age period, but we didn't have the art that Europe had and the other parts of the world had. I mean, we did, but people in sort of the cultural authorities would claim that we were behind. We were behind Europe. Yes?
And you talked about the auction that she attended when she acquired the
Yes.
Vermeer.
Yes.
Was she allowed her own agency to bid on that, and, you know, on her own without a man?
She wasn't allowed in the auction room, so only men were allowed. I was able to go to the Hotel de Row. Actually, it's still there in Paris, and it's if you are in Paris, it's a wonderful place to go. You don't have to have credentials. You can just register at the front desk, and it's fascinating to see. And in her era, that would have been considered too rough and tumble, right? And so they had to come up with this scheme so it wasn't her agent who was deciding, she was deciding, but they had this signaling system. Yeah, so.
So was that a typical public auction, a typical place to buy?
Yes.
That caliber?
Yeah, I mean, yes, in Paris it certainly was. That was an incredibly important particular collection, the Torberger collection in 1892, right? So because he was such an important collector of Dutch art. but there were other important collections that went on sale, and that it's still how people collect art is at the Hôtel Tarot. And there are other auction houses, but it just was the most important in France at the time. So yes, people went to auctions. Does that help? Did I answer your question? But they also went to galleries. There were galleries all along in the city, right, where there were dealers and connoisseurs that would evaluate what a painting to be sure it was authentic. Yes.
She wanted to support American artists.
I mean, she did. Yes, she did. She did buy John Lafarge, and she has Mary Cree Sears does her seal. She's a wonderful woman artist who does the seal of the museum. And the Dodge McKnight is an extraordinary watercolorist who studied with Van Gogh, and she names a room after him. But she's pretty clear that Dennis Bunker was an important he died tragically young, but she has quite a few of his paintings. And of course, John Singer Sargent's American, although lives overseas. But I don't think her intent was to support young artists, be a patron. Whether they were American or not wasn't really her the point, as much as that she was wanting to make possible for younger artists a path. Did I answer your question? Okay.
I've never been to the museum.
Oh.
I was curious, the top floor that was her apartment, is it open?
Yes, I mean, it's where the curators are. So yeah, it's still being used. And in fact, in 2012, there was an addition put on because the building itself was just so full, right? And so they just needed more room. So there's a beautiful addition that was put on in 2012, which really, really took the pressure off the original building itself. Yeah, it's beautiful on that fourth floor. You look over into the courtyard, and you can hear, just recently, or just on Sunday was her 184th birthday. And as part of the will, she had the brothers from the Society of St. John the Evangelist, which is a Protestant monastery across the river in Cambridge. They come every year as part of the fulfillment of the will to have a memorial service in the third floor gallery. So I was able to go to that on Sunday morning, and that was really extraordinary because it was early in the morning and the sun was coming in, and you could hear that fountain. You could hear the fountain of the courtyard. So yeah, that was really remarkable morning. Yes.
What important artwork was stolen?
The Vermeer is probably that's a heartbreaker because there's so few of them. Are there 37 or 38? I'm not sure how many there are in the world, but there's not very many. And then the Rembrandts are so heartbreaking because it was a landscape, it was a seascape. A Rembrandt, and then the other was a dual portrait, and I do write about that dual portrait at the end of the book. So that's painful. They're all painful, I think, but those are the three that come immediately to mind. Yeah. So, yes.
Do they still have the easel then, there on the one floor with the cloth over it?
Yes. And they keep. She didn't foresee that these paintings would be stolen. So, but the museum, what to do, right? And the will stipulates that not anything can be moved. So, in the spirit of that will, the museum, after the theft, keeps those empty frames in the space. And they're very kind of ghostly. A lot of them are in the Dutch room, obviously. And it's kind of a ghostly absence presence, like a ghost, right? And so, but there's just so much. I mean, I have to say the museum in the years since has really triumphed over what was a catastrophe. They really have risen above it. Yeah.
I'm new to her story, but most collectors have pieces that are not on display. So what happened to that? She must have had something that she didn't put in her museum.
Yes, I mean, she did. I mean, she put a lot of it.
Are they on display now, or what happened?
And, you know, there's a big Gardner family, so there was descendants that inherited pieces. There's some pieces that are still on the fourth floor in the curator's offices. There's,
So they really haven't changed what's on.
yes, no, they have not. They've not either added or subtracted.
So if it wasn't on display when she died,
If she didn't,
it's available for something else.
that's right. If she didn't put it there, it is not there, right? And you know what she did was she hired the very best, the photographs, those beautiful black and white photographs were taken by a man named Thomas Marr, and he was really considered the best architectural photographer in Boston at the time, because she knew to stipulate that nothing can be changed is one thing in a will, but she needed visual evidence. So he took photographs of every last wall, gallery, floor, right? We have visual documentation. There are, I think, 15 of his albums. I'm not sure how many, is it 13 or 15 of these just extraordinary images of the museum. So then you really, and her museum changes a bit from 1903, so it doesn't look the same then as it does now because she herself changed it. She had a 2-story music hall on one side of the palace, and she replaced it with the first floor Spanish cloister and a second floor tapestry room. She realized after she had opened it that she really wanted to keep collecting, and then she didn't have enough room, so she had to reconfigure the museum. Yeah, it's such good questions, such great questions, yeah.
So what is their stipulation or threat, if anything does get moved?
Yes, well, her stipulation is that it will get sold, the collection will be sold, and the proceeds will go to Harvard. Yeah, I think I have that right. I mean, that's a good question. I need to double check, but I'm pretty sure it goes to Harvard. I know that it would be because it's given to Boston, right? It's a public museum in the city of Boston, but it would be closed and yeah. Yeah, I mean, she knew it was called Fenway Court, everyone called it that, and she had it changed, she made it sure that it was called Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in the will, because she knew if she didn't, all the men that were around her, Bernard Berenson and Richard Norton and all the rest, they would get credited for what she had done. And she's very smart. She's very, very smart, yes. Yeah, it really is. Because, I mean, let's say it this way. It's everything that she intended to have on display is on display, right? It's not like there's a storage room and then they circulate that and change up what's on the walls. So when you see the 1903 photographs or the 1915 photographs, you go into that room, like the Raphael, that extraordinary photograph of the Raphael room. Those paintings are exactly in that same place. Those chairs are exactly there. That carpet is there. Now, the thing that shifted a tiny bit over the years was textiles wear out, just from hanging or from exposure. And so she had more textiles, like in the Victorian way, sort of draping furniture and tables. And some of that sort of mid-century got but now they've really studied. A friend of mine is a textile conservator, and they study these photographs very carefully. They replaced the fabric, all the textiles that hang in the Raphael room, and they contract with Italian mills to replicate those patterns that she had. So they're very attuned. As they should be, right? That's what she wanted. Does that make sense? Now, I'm not an employee of the museum, so what the conservators have in their drawers, and I'm not entirely sure how that works. But it's not a big storage room of things that are not on view that will be on view. That I know for sure.
The reason for the question is some of the earlier photographs that you were showing throughout the presentation, there were different views that had what looks like a warehouse, almost room stuffed with all kinds of stuff.
Yes.
And I'm just struggling to
I mean, some of the pictures I showed were from her homes on Beacon Street, right? So that she used as sort of, she chose the key pieces for the museum. But any picture that I showed of the museum, if you go now, you will see it that way. I know, it seems cluttered, but it's not, because the space is so high. It's just exactly like a Palazzo Barbaro, like the Palazzo Barbaro in Venice. So I had a chance to go to the Palazzo Barbaro where she stayed, and also where Henry James wrote The Wings of a Dove. So there's a scene of a description of a palace that's really, he's really describing the Palazzo Barbaro. And so you could see that the dimensions in the Palazzo in Venice are very similar to the dimensions in the room. So the ceilings are really high, and then they have those extraordinary windows that look out into the courtyard. So it doesn't feel cluttered. It seems like it would, but it doesn't. It's not. And the colors, the way the colors move and in and through each other is just really beautiful. It's really beautiful. Yes?
What's the situation with the Beacon Street house?
So she sold it eventually, and then what happened is the person who bought it tore it down. And then she had an agreement with the city that that address no longer exists. So now there's no 152 Beacon Street. There's 150 Beacon Street, and everyone confuses it for the, yeah. But somehow she made some deal with, I'm not sure how that happened. I tried to find out, but yeah, there's no 152 anymore. That was her address. Isn't that something? I know. Yes.
One of her favorite pictures of Bella that her husband had purchased was of Marie Antoinette.
Yes.
Is that in her collection?
Yes, I mean that, there's these little Marine, there's a wonderful, in the Little Salon, which is, in the, yeah, it's called the Little Salon, and it's 18th century French, and there's a darling little sort of miniature of Marie Antoinette. Those engravings that Jack gave her, and you've been reading the book. Yes. And so early in their marriage, because there was not a lot of, like I said, there was not a lot of primary source material to draw from. I looked at all of the lists of that Jack kept of the purchases, and I had those early purchases in the 1860s, and he kept purchasing these prints of Marie Antoinette. And I thought, that's very interesting. So there's this extraordinary book by Carolyn Weber called Queen of Fashion about Marie Antoinette. And I realized that Marie Antoinette was a woman from elsewhere who had come into the city and was at Paris and was rejected, right? And I thought, is that a coincidence that Jack's giving her those prints? Is he saying something about that? And so what was very moving to me is we know on the 4th floor boudoir in Fenway Court that she kept 2 of those Marie Antoinette prints always up, these etchings that she had bought in New York. But because it was in the 4th floor, it wasn't covered by the will. And so anything that was in her private apartment, we have a list of what was there, but where those items went after, through the 20th century, it's not entirely clear. Does that? Yes. Thank you for that good question. Thank you for reading. Thank you. What a great audience. No wonder everyone comes here. Thank you. Thank you. Did you have one more?
Yeah, one quick one. Could you go back to teaching and we can all come to your class?
That's very kind. Thank you so much. That's very kind. I miss the classroom very much, so thank you very much for that. Thank you. Yes, I love being a writer, but you can only have one life here, so thank you.